Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to our presentation on gliders, the flying coffins of World War II. We extend a warm welcome to our fellow veterans who are viewing this program from the Edith Norris Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in nearby Bedford, Massachusetts. Glider pilots, time and again, risked their lives during World War II to bring troops, supplies, and equipment into enemy territory. Gliders had no motors, canvas skin, and wooden wings. They were sitting ducks while airborne, and they nearly always suffered damage on landing. According to General William Westmoreland, never before in history had any nation produced aviators whose duty it was deliberately to crash land and then go on to fight as infantrymen. Our speaker, Jim Ramsey, was inspired to create this program by his friendship with a former World War II glider pilot, Peter Pecos, whom he met as a volunteer at the Bedford VA hospital. Jim earned bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering from Cornell University. He completed the ROTC program at Cornell, and he served in the U.S. Navy Civil Engineering Corps for 5 years. A Harvard MBA, Jim worked in management consulting, and he held marketing and business development positions with several companies. He's a member of our executive committee. We're very proud to introduce him. Please welcome Jim Ramsey. Take it away, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. It's a great pleasure to see all the familiar faces, basically to be back meeting with the Lexington Veterans Association. I sure wish we could all be together and share coffee and shake hands and all that, but I think we all know it's going to be a little while before we can get back to the library and do that. So this is certainly a second best thing, and I'm just very happy to be here with all of you. Thanks for coming. So what I'm going to do is kind of like what Bob Lewis did a few minutes ago, is share my screen and bring up a PowerPoint presentation, some slides. So give me just a minute, please.
Oh, cool.
Okay. So just 1 second. All right. So hopefully you're all looking at the full screen title slide. And I will begin. At noon on March 24th, 1945, a little more than 75 years ago, Second Lieutenant Peter Pecos was crossing the Rhine River and preparing to land his combat glider behind enemy lines near the small town of WESEL, Germany. This is Rob Broom's painting of Peter's glider at that moment. Peter, his co-pilot, 6 medics, and a jeep and a trailer filled with medical supplies he was transporting were part of Operation VARSITY, the largest single-day airborne operation of World War II, and a key part of the Allied offensive at the end of the war to cross the Rhine River and establish a firm position inside Germany for the first time in the war. Peter had been preparing for this day since he joined the Army Air Forces 3 years earlier in March 1942. Peter was on a double tow with another glider being towed by a C-47 transport plane, which you see here in this painting. As they neared the landing zone, the anti-aircraft fire was so intense that the C-47 pilot panicked and cut the two gliders loose early. So I'm going to show you, this is the C-47 transport plane towing the gliders. The gliders, of course, had no motors, so they had to be towed to the drop point. This is the tow line connecting to Peter's glider. This is Peter's glider here, the tow line connecting to it, and this is the tow line connecting to another glider. These gliders were all towed in pairs. And this is the C-47. You see the flak all over the sky here. He cut them loose early, and there they were. So Peter began his descent into the hellhole below earlier than expected, no doubt wondering what his glider's fate would be as he approached the landing zone. We will return to Operation Varsity after I tell you something about combat gliders and about Peter Pecos. This is Peter around the time of Operation Varsity. I met him a few years ago, as Linda mentioned, when he was a resident in the Community Living Center at the Bedford VA Hospital. He was always wearing his glider pilot cap, so it was very clear that he was a glider pilot. At that point, all I knew about gliders was the sleek sailplanes that I used to see catching an updraft off the coast of California during my time there with the Navy back in the 60s. Peter and his wife Edna, whom you've met, showed me the painting we just saw, which hung in Peter's room at the hospital. And I knew right away that this was a different kind of glider from what I had seen before. Peter told me a little of his experience as a glider pilot, which was enough to get me started on a journey of discovery about combat gliders and their pilots, and the key role they played in the airborne army of World War II. Peter passed away at the hospital last year on May 29th, just 2 weeks shy of his 100th birthday, which he would have celebrated on June 11th. So obviously, with today being June 8th, we're right about the 1-year anniversary of Peter's death. I am so happy that Edna and her children, Peter and Deborah, could be here today to share in this occasion, and other members of the Pecos family whom Linda mentioned. And I'm very grateful to them for sharing so much information about Peter's service in World War II. Without that, this presentation really wouldn't have been possible. I thank also Rob Broom for sharing that great picture, and one other picture and one drawing that you will see later on, and other information from his discussions with Peter. You all were a tremendous help to me. Thank you very much. Now these photos show airborne infantry troops and a Jeep being unloaded from a WACO, that's WACO, CG-4A combat glider, the model that Peter Pecos flew. Just give me 1 minute here. Okay. Okay, in addition to the pilot and co-pilot, the CG-4A carried 13 infantry troops, which is what you see in this top picture, or a smaller number of troops, plus a Jeep or a 75mm howitzer. That's the configuration that you see here. And by the way, I hope that what you're looking at is an enlarged pointer that I tried to set up on my computer. It's much larger than the smaller pointer that we typically have. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It shows up on my screen. Hopefully it shows up on yours, but it's the best I can do.
Jim, it's Linda. I hate to interrupt, but Kevin Pecos has sent a request. Could you allow him to record the session? And I think you're the only one who can do that.
Well, the answer is yes.
I think he'd be very grateful to be able to.
I think he's got a name that merits being able to record this.
Thank you.
Peter, as I understand it, Peter is, Kevin is Peter Pecos Sr.'s nephew. The final point with this slide is that the CG-4A was really the workhorse of the American glider fleet. It accounted for 95% of the glider operations in World War II. There were some other models, but this is basically it. This is a cutaway view of the CG-4A that is on display at the Air Mobility Command Museum at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. As you can see, this glider is transporting a Jeep. Troops and supplies would be, actually, sorry folks, I obviously got a little flustered here. The glider is transporting a Jeep. Troops and supplies would be packed in behind the Jeep. In order for this ungainly aircraft to glide effectively and safely to its landing zone, it had to be as lightweight as possible. Thus, it was designed with a canvas skin around a frame of steel tubing with wooden wings and floor. So the canvas skin has been removed from the left side of the glider, as you can see, which enables us to see the steel tube frame. That's basically this. The wooden wing, this is basically all wood construction in the wing, and the canvas skin covering the wing. We can also see the tow rope, which connected the glider to the tow plane. The CG-4A weighed 3,900 pounds when empty, nearly double that, 7,500 pounds when fully loaded. Basically a 3,600 pound maximum payload. The glider had no brakes, but it could roll to a stop in as little as 200 to 300 yards. It carried no armament, nothing to defend itself. Now this slide shows the nose opening vertically to facilitate the rapid unloading of the Jeep. The Jeep was unloaded before the pilots exited the glider. It had to get out quickly. So as you can see, this is the cockpit. This is where the pilots were. And so when the nose was fully raised, the pilots were basically lying on their backs. So in addition to all the other difficult challenges they faced, they had to scramble out of here from a very awkward position. Okay, back. Sorry. And for all you pilots out there, this is the view from the cockpit. And by the way, the glider pilots did not carry parachutes. They were in it until they landed. Now this is the CG-4A in flight. You can see the tow line that connected the glider to its C-47 tow plane. Hopefully you can see that. The tow line was a nylon rope, 350 feet long and 11/16 inches in diameter, just a little less than 3/4 of an inch. Standard practice was for the glider pilot to release the tow line from his end when it was time to descend to the landing zone, but the C-47 pilot could release the line in an emergency, which is what we saw really in the title slide with Peter's glider. The normal cruise speed under tow was 120 miles an hour. Glide speed after release was 70 miles an hour. Landing speed was 60 miles an hour. So imagine landing not on a runway, but on fields of uneven nature with obstacles at 60 miles per hour. Even with its lightweight construction, the CG-4A didn't glide particularly well. Its glide ratio was 12-1, which means that it glided 12 feet horizontally for every foot of drop. This is considerably worse even than the 17-to-1 glide ratio of the Airbus A320, that Captain Sully Sullenberger landed in the Hudson River. And that plane certainly wasn't designed as a glider, although it did glide. So what this all means is that this glider pilot, didn't have much space or time to land his glider once he was released from the tow plane. Now, gliders had key advantages that made them an essential part, along with paratroopers, of all Allied airborne operations of the war. The gliders were a simple and cheap solution to a complex tactical and technical problem: how to land an organized unit of troops with a full complement of weapons and equipment behind enemy lines in a small area inaccessible to traditional aircraft. And they were the first stealth aircraft able to approach and land silently. Paratroopers also landed silently, of course, but they could not always be certain of landing together in a tight-knit group. They were sometimes widely separated on landing, consuming precious time to regroup as a fighting unit. And there were practical limits on the types of weapons and equipment that could be dropped by parachute. Just as a kind of a sidebar, although this presentation really focuses on the use of gliders in combat operations, major airborne combat operations, but it should be noted that gliders were also used extensively throughout the war to resupply the advancing Allied forces. But the gliders were vulnerable. This on the left is an American glider that was destroyed on landing in Operation Varsity at WESEL. And this is a defensive measure employed by the Germans at Normandy. Known as Rommel's asparagus, these 13 to 16 foot poles were placed in fields to disrupt glider landings, and they would indeed disrupt the landing. They would probably destroy the glider and whatever the glider was containing, including all of its personnel. They were very effective. Now, in flight, behind their tow planes, the gliders were relatively safe, unless, of course, the tow rope broke or the glider came apart in flight. And that happened. It didn't happen so much in Operation Varsity, which was one of the later operations, but earlier there were all kinds of cases of tow ropes breaking, gliders coming apart in flight. So there were dangers really everywhere. Once they began their descent and landed behind enemy lines, the features that made gliders so effective in airborne operations also rendered them extremely vulnerable. With their canvas skin and wooden construction, the gliders were vulnerable to damage or destruction from enemy anti-aircraft or ground fire. The CG-4A had no engines, no brakes, no armament, so it couldn't abort a landing, couldn't stop short of an obstacle like a fence or a wall, and couldn't defend itself. The lightweight construction, coupled with far less than ideal conditions on the landing zones, resulted in nearly all gliders suffering at least some damage on landing. They were truly disposable aircraft. Now, Peter Pecos described it this way in a 2012 interview that he did with the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. Quote, "It was always pick a field out, check your trees, check your boulders, check the ground as close as you can. You could knock the tip off a wing or a tail to get into a place, but you had to land very quickly, and it's only, of course, one shot." So imagine landing an aircraft with almost expecting to have to hit the tip of your wing into a tree or a rock in order to stop. That's basically what these pilots were facing routinely. So with every landing, a barely controlled crash landing, who in his right mind would want to become a glider pilot? Glider pilots were a special breed. They were highly skilled pilots, and they were obviously willing, even eager, to take huge risks They carried airborne infantry troops into battle, but they were not infantry themselves. They were assigned to the 9th Troop Carrier Command, same as the pilots who flew the tow planes. Their job was to fly gliders, not fight the Germans on the ground. But what were they to do after landing? They couldn't just fly their glider back to home base. The glider was stuck there. So after helping unload troops and equipment, they formed up into companies of glider pilots. Their top priority was to make their way to a pickup point to be returned to their bases. They were needed for the next glider missions. Their next priority was guarding prisoners of war and other non-combat tasks. But they often had no choice but to fight. And in fact, Peter and many of the glider pilots did join the fight once they exited their gliders. When World War II started, the US had no gliders or glider pilots, nor did we have paratroopers. There was no US Airborne Army, so it had to be developed from scratch. In 1940 and 1941, the Germans had great success with gliders in airborne operations in Belgium and Crete, respectively. Allied military leaders were impressed with the German successes, and by early 1941 concluded that gliders could be strategically important for the Allies in the coming effort to retake Europe from the Axis powers. And in February 1941, the US launched an effort to develop, quote, a glider that could be towed by an aircraft. February 1941. The WACO CG-4A, which we saw earlier, was the only prototype to pass structural and flight tests. It was designed by WACO Aircraft Manufacturing Company of Troy, Ohio. In July 1942, WACO, Ford, Cessna, and 13 other companies received contracts to produce the CG-4A. Initial production was sufficient to provide the 136 gliders used in the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. By the time the war ended, 13,909 gliders had been produced. The largest producer by far was Ford. As to the glider pilots, in July 1941, the US began to train 150 power pilots as glider pilot instructors. In December of that year, the requirement was set for 1,000 pilots. And by the end of the war, more than 6,000 glider pilots had been trained. I don't know, let's see. You can see that. Now, this was a tremendous mobilization effort that was only one of many mobilization efforts required to adequately fight World War II on two major fronts, many miles apart. This in itself is an amazing story, and the whole story of mobilization is a remarkable one, to be sure. So let's see how Peter Pecos became one of those 6,000 highly skilled glider pilots. Here you see Peter standing by his glider. He's written his kid brother Basil's name. This, by the way, apologies for the poor quality of the photo, but it's an original taken with Peter's camera by obviously a friend of his. You see his kid brother Basil's name. You see his hometown, Stoneham, Mass. Here on the glider. Peter obtained a private pilot's license while attending the Middlesex University School of Podiatry in Boston, graduating in 1941. He was drafted early in 1942. He was a private in the US Army. Because he was a trained pilot, he was recruited very shortly after that to join the Army Air Force's glider pilot training program. And on March 25th, 1942, he joined the Army Air Forces. He went to Big Spring, Texas, where he trained in Piper Cubs, but he practiced landing on fields, not on runways. And to simulate the glider experience, the way that worked was his instructor would basically, unbeknownst to Peter, unannounced, would shut off the engine without warning. Couldn't be restarted. Peter would have to make a, quote, dead stick landing in the nearest field. He then went to boot camp for basic infantry training to learn how to be an infantryman should he need to use those skills. By mid-1943, he was training in the CG-4A itself at airfields in Texas and North Carolina. By fall 1944, basically 2.5 years after he joined the Army Air Forces, Peter had received multiple promotions, ultimately to second lieutenant and glider pilot. He had made it. And he joined the 442nd Troop Carrier Group, 305th Squadron in Saint-André-de-Loire, France, to prepare for his first combat mission. So I think we're back in action, at least for a while. Next slide. Gliders were used in every major Allied campaign in Europe. Although gliders are the focus of this presentation, it should be noted that paratroopers also played a major part in all of these airborne campaigns. Essentially, the mission was the same. The gliders carried infantry in the glider, 13 at most. Paratroopers jumped from planes with their parachutes one at a time. The objective in all cases was to get troops deployed behind enemy lines for fighting. This slide shows the major missions and the number of CG-4A gliders used. Sicily, Normandy, southern France, the attempted Rhine crossing in Holland, the Battle of the Bulge, and finally, the Rhine crossing at Wesel, Germany. You can see the operations, the dates, the numbers of gliders. I said before that Operation Varsity was the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. It was. Operation Market Garden in Holland occurred over a several-day period. Obviously, this number of gliders is much bigger than this, but as a single-lift, single-day operation, Varsity was the biggest. The glider war got off to a very shaky start in the first mission, Sicily, in July 1943, when some of the gliders and tow planes were shot down by Allied naval vessels. It must have been a real comedy of errors. There's nothing comic about it, but gliders were shot down by friendly ships. A lot of gliders had their tow ropes break and they went into the Mediterranean or the English Channel. There were all kinds of problems and a lot of loss of life. But as you might expect, glider operations improved with each succeeding mission. And on March 24th, 1945, Operation Varsity, the Allies used all they'd learned in the previous 2 years to successfully execute that operation, the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. It is March 1945. The Battle of the Bulge is over. Allied forces have penetrated into Germany on the west side of the Rhine River, along a 100-plus mile front near Wesel in the north to below Cologne on the south, having driven German forces back across the Rhine. So let me just show you here. The big blue line is the Rhine River. Here's Wesel in the north, Cologne in the south, the area we're talking about. And the Allied forces are basically well established on the west side of the Rhine, and the Germans have been driven to the east side. And Allied leaders are now planning the last big operation of the war, crossing the Rhine and encircling the RUHR area, trapping hundreds of thousands of German troops and bringing the war to an end. And so this circle is oval, is basically the area we're talking about. You may not be able to see it, but this small blue line coming off of Duisburg, that is the Ruhr River. And I guess this was really the industrial heartland of Germany. So this was the target area, but they had to get across the Rhine, the Americans had to get across the Rhine in force in order then to be able to continue the charge. So this is the challenge that the final challenge that we're talking about. General Eisenhower put Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery in charge of the northernmost and largest Rhine crossing operation. Montgomery chose the small German town of Wesel as the focus of the crossing, primarily because he figured that the Germans had amassed a large force in a heavily wooded area nearby. And he was correct. German Army Group H, with a force of 85,000 troops, was sitting astride the path of the attack. It was to be a two-part operation, Operation Plunder, an amphibious assault across the river, and Operation Varsity, an airborne invasion behind enemy lines right there at Wesel. Operation Plunder commenced the evening of Friday, March 23rd. Operation Varsity was executed during daylight hours the next day, Saturday, March 24th. Operation Plunder involved 4 Army divisions, 2 British, 2 American, and 1 British Commando Brigade. This overall operation was commanded by British Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey. So this is Plunder starting on the east side, the west side of the Rhine River. British 51st and 15th Divisions, the British 1st Commando Brigade, 2 US infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, all poised to cross the Rhine. And so this must have been something in the neighborhood of 60 or 70,000 troops. The map also shows the drop and landing zones for Operation Varsity for the paratroopers and gliders, both British and American. So you had 2 airborne divisions, the British 6th and the US 17th. The British landed in this general area in the northern part, just like the British had the northern part of the amphibious invasion, and the southern area was the US 17th Airborne Division. And each of these divisions had 2 regiments of paratroopers and 1 regiment of glider infantry. Both divisions had that, each division. So each had gliders, each had paratroopers. Now this airborne force had 2 objectives. The first, the most immediate, was to seize the high ground in the forest above the river and neutralize the German artillery firing at the infantry. You had German artillery basically hidden or concealed to some extent here in the forest. They were trying to repulse the infantry coming across the river here. And so a key objective of the airborne was to neutralize the Germans in this forest. The secondary objective of the airborne was to go the other way and basically secure bridges along the ISIL River. This was a substantial river. It had 5 or 6 bridges across kind of in this area. All those bridges had to be secured because after the invasion was wrapped up, that was just a starting point. Troops then had to basically move out, head to the east, and they had to be able to cross that river. So those were the 2 objectives: secure the bridges and neutralize the Germans firing on the infantry. Now, as I said, each airborne division, just to reinforce the point, each airborne division had 2 paratroop regiments. So 2 paratroop regiments here, 2 paratroop regiments of the British, and each had 1 glider infantry regiment. So gliders were deployed to carry the troops in. 906 WACO CG-4As were used to transport the glider infantry regiment, support troops, and equipment of the 17th Airborne Division. So as the chart you just saw showed, 906 gliders brought the US glider infantry, and support forces in to this area. They basically came in just after the paratroopers came in. Varsity had three key features that were designed to swamp and overwhelm the German defenders and achieve a rapid link-up with ground forces crossing the river. First, the ground forces, for the first time in the war, the ground forces attacked before the airborne operation was launched. In previous operations, the airborne came in first. This time, as you know, as I mentioned, the ground infantry came in the night before. They wanted to get a jump on it, and that would basically facilitate a rapid link-up with the airborne force. Secondly, the airborne divisions landed in daylight, much closer to German positions than in previous airborne invasions. Landing in daylight gave them, of course, a much better chance of landing where they were supposed to land, both paratroopers and gliders. It, of course, also exposed them to put them at greater risk of enemy fire, since the enemy could see them better, just like they could see the landing conditions better. And the third thing is, it was a massive airborne operation. 20,000 paratroopers and glider infantry were delivered in a single lift. Lift meaning basically flight of airplanes. In just 2.5 hours on an area that measures only 5 by 6 miles. It was shock and awe on a grand scale. So between these two areas, 20,000 paratroopers and glider infantry were landed, obviously from planes that had taken off. I'll show you where they came from in a minute, and all done in 2.5 hours. So one can only imagine what the German forces seeing this coming must have felt. So how did these 20,000 troops get delivered right on target so quickly the morning of March 24th? By an amazingly well-coordinated single airlift from 23 airfields in France and Britain that stretched 300 miles to the Rhine. This is a very confusing diagram, but I'll try to simplify it greatly. Basically, all these lines are lines of troop carrier, basically the routes of the planes carrying the troops, either towing gliders or carrying paratroops. The line crossing the English Channel will start here. This line of aircraft were all of the English glider and paratrooper forces, and they were coming from 11 airfields in England. So planes took off in a marvelously choreographed sequence. They basically joined, formed a single so-called sky train that then went this way onto Belgium and ultimately on to WESEL, the target. These lines to the south in France represent the American routes. They were coming from 12 airfields in France. So these various dots that have lines connected to them, each had forces that became part of this airborne armada. Peter Pecos, I've got a circle around this one, Saint-André-de-Loire. This is where Peter Pecos' 442nd Troop Carrier Group took off at 9 o'clock that morning, looking at a nice three-hour flight from Saint-André-de-Loire to WESEL. The American and British sky trains converged over Belgium, right here, to form the greatest airborne armada of the war, and probably the greatest airborne armada of all time, heading to the Rhine River and WESEL. It was about a 3-hour flight for Peter from here. The whole thing, if one were a civilian, if one were standing here looking up when the first planes came over and you had a strong enough neck, you would be continuing to look up for the next 3 hours. There would have been a steady stream of aircraft flying at about 100 to 120 miles an hour. So it must have been an awesome sight. You're actually going to see a little bit of that in a video that I have for you. So what was the total combined air force, if you will? 4,000 American and British aircraft, 1,696 transports, 1,348 gliders, and 1,000 fighter escorts to protect them from attack from the Germans. All of that to carry 20,000 troops and to be able to somehow magically drop all of those troops in a span of just 2.5 hours here in WESEL. Must have been something. So at this point, keeping my fingers crossed, I'm gonna switch gears and I'm gonna share with you a video. We'll get to the video in a minute. I just want to give you a brief intro. The real life footage from this airborne operation illustrates a number of things I've talked about thus far. American and British gliders being towed by their tow planes during takeoff from bases in England and France and in flight, the massive air armada over Belgium, and gliders landing behind enemy lines at WESEL, Germany, even a crash landing, unfortunately. And troops exiting their gliders and moving out against the enemy. You will also see paratrooper operations in this video. I said it before and I'll say it again. I won't say it again. This is the last time. As I mentioned earlier, Operation VARSITY and all the major European campaigns use paratroopers as well as gliders. One point about the video. You'll hear the narrator describe an Allied airborne force of 40,000 troops. I've just finished telling you that the number was more like 20,000. I think that's an accurate, the latter, the 20,000 is an accurate number. That's still an awful lot of troops.
South of Paris,
okay, here we go.
Paratroopers begin to assemble for the greatest single
May
airborne
need to
operation
turn up
in
your
all
volume
history.
to hear it
Officers
properly.
and men of the U.S. 17th Airborne Division don their gear before entering the troop carriers. The aircraft are C-47s loading 18 men, and for the first time, Curtiss Commando transports, which carry 36 paratroopers. The C-46 Commando is fitted with 2 doors and drops its shooters from both sides simultaneously. Meanwhile, at Allied bases in England, the British 6th Airborne Division begins another phase of the operations. Activities are in exact synchronization with the takeoffs of the U.S. 17th Airborne from France. Gliders jammed with equipment are ready to be hooked up to British Sterling bombers. Glider-borne Tommies get aboard for the trip to the bridgehead sector, where British commandos already have launched Marshal Montgomery's thrust across the lower Rhine. At the same time, the American glider-borne infantry is moving out of airfields in France. These units climb into the WACO or CG-4A glider. It normally carries 12 fully equipped soldiers or a combination of soldiers and equipment up to 4,000 pounds. The nylon rope is prepared for hooking the glider behind the tow ship. Ready for the takeoff. CG-4A glider can be hauled as fast as 150 miles per hour with its full load, although normal cruising speed behind a C-47 is 120 miles per hour. All American gliders in this operation are towed in pairs. The troops taken aloft constitute the 194th Glider Infantry Regiment. From nearby French airfields, the paratroopers take off. initial elements of Lieutenant General Louis H. Brereton's 1st Allied Airborne Army on their way toward the Rhine. In the same early dawn across the Channel in England, a Sterling leaves the airfield with the first British glider to go aloft in the 24th March operations. Two types of gliders carry the British troops' weapons and supplies. The Hamilcar, which can transport a light tank of approximately 8 tons or any other equivalent load. The Horsa, which is the British standard glider and carries a load of 3 tons. Both are towed singly. Inside one of the gliders. Aboard a Sterling bomber as the glider train wings its way over the British countryside. Crossing the English Channel. The rendezvous point for the British and American aircraft is near Brussels. Streaming eastward across Belgium, the two great aerial task forces total 1,600 planes, 1,400 gliders, and 40,000 troops. Over the ruins of Belgian towns. General Brereton and British officers watch the air armada wing its way toward the objective. Approaching the Rhine River, one of our aircraft lies in flames near the river's bank. Paratroopers and parapacked supplies spill out over the drop zone in the WESEL area. In this leapfrog of enemy positions east of the Rhine, the objective of the airborne divisions is first to contain the German rear and then make a quick junction with the ground troops. C-46, caught by FLAK, dives toward the ground. The gliders are ready to be cut loose. At the signal, glider from tow ship, the nylon tow rope is unhitched. First glider landings without mishap. Fighters and bombers have been maintaining a protective cover over the area, which is infested with concealed FLAK positions. One of the crack-ups. This operation is a reversal of the Allied airborne tactics in Normandy and Holland. Here, the glider and parachute forces come in after the ground troops begin their cross-Rhine assault. Moving out against targets as mapped during the briefing sessions. Assembling squads and forming into fighting units, they spread out behind the Nazi lines. On the first day, the airborne troops capture 6 bridges across the ISIL River intact. They seize 4,000 German troops behind their own front line.
That's just about the end of the video. I wanted to stop it before I got to some promotional piece. So that was a pretty cool newsreel, I thought. I'm going to now go back with confidence to the presentation. Let's see. Okay. So now let's return to Peter Pecos over WESEL at noon on March 24th, 1945. Arms aching after struggling to hold his CG-4A in level flight during the 3-hour flight from San Andre, Peter prepared to land his glider on the landing zone N, which you see here. Oh, this drawing of Rob Bruin referred to this. This is a wonderful drawing of his, showing basically the glider landing, Peter's landing activity. It shows the C-47 tow plane and 2 gliders, Peter's and one other, shortly before the transport took flak and released them early. You can see the tow plane turning as it encountered the flak, the glider release point, and the glide path into landing zone N. So here's the turn, here's the release point, and here's the path that the gliders took into landing zone N. And by the way, you see how close it is to this forest, the Deersforder forest that the German troops were in. What was Peter thinking as he began his descent? He must have been thinking first and foremost about how the Germans were trained to deliver a relentless barrage of anti-aircraft and machine gun fire against the gliders while in the air and on the ground before the troops could exit, especially since he and the other gliders would be landing right on top of the Germans. Remember, that was one of the key points of the whole operation, land right on top of the Germans. The slow-moving gliders would be tempting targets for German artillery waiting below. Now, what Peter couldn't have known, Peter, as I mentioned at the beginning, Peter's glider was actually carrying medics and medical supplies and equipment to provide medical support for the combat operations. So, and he was part of a group of support. A support group that had engineers and medics and other signal corps. So the plan was, because they were less well equipped as infantry than the paratroopers or the glider infantry that came in before, the plan for this operation for landing zone N was that one of the earlier paratroop regiments who landed in a nearby drop zone, they would come over and clear this landing zone of the enemy to make it easier for Peter and the rest of the gliders in his group. Well, unbeknownst to Peter, that group, that parachute group, again, as happens with paratrooper operations, that group was misdropped. They landed somewhere else. They got into a real fight with the Germans and did well. But the problem for Peter is that this area, which was supposed to be clear, was not. And that's what was waiting for him when he landed. This is a Rob Bruin painting of another glider flying into WESEL that day. Great painting. That glider was hit by anti-aircraft fire that blew a hole in the wing and produced a large fireball that caused the observer in the tow plane to report the glider destroyed. Looks pretty serious, doesn't it? Somehow the pilot managed to land this glider safely, and Rob, in fact, talked to him too. Now, Peter knew that he was extremely vulnerable to flak and that he would be lucky to navigate through it. He was also thinking about the terrain at landing zone N. He knew something about this ahead of time from Allied intelligence. The good news was that there would be no Rommel's asparagus. Remember that from the slide earlier? It was also good news that the landing zone was on firm, level ground, consisting of meadows and fields. The not so good news was that the fields were only 200 to 300 yards in length, with numerous wooden fences and drainage ditches. The land, it took at least 200, it took two to 300 yards for the glide typically to land and come to a complete stop. So they were really tempting fate here with the conditions in the landing zone. Peter somehow got through the flak and the smoke from a smoke screen that had been laid down by Allies the night before, and he landed safely in a field. These are his own words from the Veterans History Project interview. Quote, "So I landed. I had 3 flak holes over the tail. Flak holes. He had been hit by flak. Lucky, lucky, lucky." End quote. Lucky to be sure, but also a great deal of skill as pilot of that glider, not to mention great courage and nerves of steel. So Peter, his co-pilot, and the medics with their jeep, trailer, and supplies exited their glider. Peter took this photo with the caption, as you can see, part of it, "Action landing on WESEL. Advanced under fire to round up wounded paratroopers and formed field hospital on site." Peter and the medics he was carrying got right to work. But they also had to deal with the German forces defending that area. They had to fight. This is how Peter described how he was equipped for combat. Quote, "When you go into an invasion, you go into it with 2 hand grenades on the left side of your leg, 2 incendiary grenades on your knee. You've got a belt of ammunition. You've got a .45. You've got a carbine in the back. And my favorite was a Thompson submachine gun." So Peter was really well armed. The rest of the caption on this photo, which I haven't included on here, is as follows, quote, "Ground fighting against German 88s. This is German 88 millimeter anti-aircraft and anti-tank artillery. Blown onto jeep, back injured from 88. So Peter was injured. Despite his injuries, Peter also engaged in house-to-house combat that day. And he helped capture, round up, and guard German prisoners. This is another photo of Peter's, of some of the 2,500 German prisoners captured that day. At 3:00 p.m. on D-Day, March 24th, the airborne troops linked up with the ground infantry that had crossed the river. Well before sunset, Operation Varsity was declared a complete success. General Eisenhower later called it the most successful airborne operation carried out to date. This was the last large-scale use of gliders in World War II. Eventually, more than 1 million Allied troops would pour across the Rhine River in the vicinity of WESEL. Just imagine that, 1 million troops. The war would soon be over. But the day had taken a heavy toll on the Allies. Casualties for the British and American airborne divisions and the glider pilots who flew them were greater than anticipated. Losses for the American and British airborne infantry divisions, infantrymen, 740 killed, 1,565 wounded. 70 American and British glider pilots were killed, and 183 of them were injured. So indeed, the day took a real toll. But the Allies carried the day in a big way. At 9:00 a.m. on D-Day +1, March 25th, the Allied glider pilots were relieved from the line. That day, 583 American glider pilots marched all the way back to the Rhine as armed escorts to 2,456 German prisoners. By the end of D-Day +6, March 30th, nearly all of the glider pilots, including Peter Pecos, had been ferried back across the Rhine and transported back to their bases in France. Well, what to do with the 900 plus American gliders remaining on the field around Wesel? I mean, these are a few of them. They were all over the place. It was important to recover as many of them as possible. Gliders would continue to play an important role in the war. They would be used to resupply American forces as they advanced into Germany. On March 26, glider salvage and recovery operations started. A small caretaker attachment arriving that day found most of the gliders greatly damaged. Some 600 glider technicians arrived on April 4th, a couple of weeks later, and eventually repaired 148 CG-4As. 148, that's out of 906 gliders that landed. So that's 16% of the gliders were repairable, which is graphic evidence of what those glider pilots faced trying to land and the damage that they actually, it would be very unlikely if they weren't damaged, the gliders that is. The 148 gliders were then picked up and returned to France for complete overhaul. 758 gliders, that is the remainder, were left on the fields around Wesel, a memorial to Operation Varsity, the greatest airborne operation of the war. This is what General William C. Westmoreland had to say about the combat glider pilots of World War II. The intrepid pilots who flew the gliders were as unique as their motorless flying machines. Never before in history had any nation produced aviators whose duty it was deliberately to crash land and then go on to fight as combat infantrymen. They were no ordinary fighters. Their battlefields were behind enemy lines. For a month following Operation Varsity, Peter flew glider resupply missions for the advancing American troops. After Germany surrendered on May 7th, he got orders to Lubbock, Texas, where he began preparations for going to Japan. Fortunately, Japan surrendered on August 15th, and the war was over for Peter and millions of American troops. In September, September 1945, Peter received the Air Medal for meritorious achievement in Operation Varsity. Later that month, he returned to Boston and was discharged. He returned to Stoneham, where he lived the rest of his life. He resumed his podiatry practice, and if you can believe it, he continued it until the age of 90. He was a strong man. Peter married Edna in 1946. They were married for 72 years. Thank you very much. The end.
Thank you very much.
Well, first, I think that we should give Jim a new award for perseverance under fire in a non-combat situation.
Thank you. I see a lot of clapping hands there. That's great. And, I guess for a maiden voyage, we recovered okay. I think you got most of the meat of it after the fix. So thank you for your patience. I mean, I guess you didn't really have any place to go, and I wouldn't have known anyway since I can barely see you. But thanks.
Thank you, Jim.
We truly appreciate everybody sticking with us. Now we hope you have questions for Jim. So anyone with a question, several of you have already been unmuted. If you are not unmuted, please click the participant box, find your name, and click on the icon that shows a hand. And that way we will spot you that you wish to talk, and we'll call on you. Aha. Peter Pecos, is that an old one, or is that you wishing to speak? I'm unmuting you, I think. Peter?
Pete?
Yep. Maybe not?
Yep.
Okay. Phil Schaefer has a question. Phil, I think you're all set. Go.
It was truly outstanding. Jim, have a question. How much control of the glider did the pilot have? Did they have ailerons, rudder control?
Yes, I think they did. I'm not a pilot myself, and I didn't go into this, but yes, they had a lot of control, because once they were, for instance, in this operation Varsity, they knew that they were really, really vulnerable to ground attack. So they talked about how basically the glider pilots just got themselves into what they call a tight spiral and just came down as quickly as possible. So they obviously were able to get themselves into a tight turn as they descended. And so, yes, there were certainly some controls.
And they had spoilers as well, so you could really descend very rapidly.
Oh, yeah. Somebody, Arthur Dalton.
Yeah, I can't get a picture at all. I had a picture initially, but you're probably just as well off. My picture.
Hey, is that Arthur Daltus or some other Arthur?
No, it's Arthur's iPad. I have my iPad.
We got you twice here.
What?
We have you twice under you. Are you this Arthur Daltus?
No, Arthur Sotak.
Okay, fine.
They're different Arthur.
And well, the reason that they had to pilot a lot, they had the ailerons and rudder, is because of the turbulence behind the C-46. You know, they were in that turbulent propeller downwash. So they had to try to control while they were going along. And of course, once they were cut loose, then they had to try to maneuver the aircraft.
Right. Yeah, you saw, I think in the video, there was one shot of the pilot and co-pilot struggling, working the controls. I forget, what's that called, Bob? It's not a steering wheel, right? It's a yoke?
Correct.
Anyway,
correct. That's what we call it, a yoke.
And basically, the challenge was even greater because you had two gliders being towed, next to each other. So not only did they have to kind of keep the right attitude and so forth, but they had to be sure they didn't crash into the glider that was flying alongside them.
Mhm.
And that happened, on a few occasions. So.
Okay, Jim, we have a question from David Horton.
David.
Okay.
Hi, David. He needs to be unmuted. I'll unmute him.
I thought I had.
Okay, I think, David, you're okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Wonderful presentation and visuals, whatever. Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim. This is really a question for his family. I'm wondering if he talked about his experiences during the war with his family, or was he one of those people who tended not to say anything at all? I just wondered how he had any, if he recalled what he did during those days, and his family knows about that.
Why don't we ask his family?
Yeah, Pete, you are unmuted.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And
Yep.
Edna, we
Yes,
haven't
he
seen
did.
you yet.
He did talk. So what I recall is when I was a young boy growing up, he didn't say much about the war. And in later years, as I would start questioning him more and more, pulling at the straws, he would start to share more. So I think it was difficult when he first came back from the war to continue to live the war. And it wasn't until his life was well established that he felt more comfortable when asked. Did you say that's right, Mom?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Edna, do you have anything you want to say?
Oh, I was just so grateful that he came home in one piece. And we enjoyed our 72 years with the wonderful family that we have. And I want to thank Jim Ramsey for this beautiful presentation. Excellent.
Did you grow up in Stoneham? Is that how you
No.
two met?
No.
Well, you're going to tell us how?
Nosy.
At a USO dance, maybe, or something? Okay.
Tell them how you met.
Let's just see. Oh, Lorraine Marquis,
Yes, dear.
I think you're unmuted. You mentioned that you thought it would be a nice idea to give a plug for the recent achievement of the celebrations committee. Go ahead.
Okay, well, as everybody knows, this year everything is virtual. So town celebrations couldn't do their Memorial Day or their program or any of that, so we decided to do it virtually. So we presented a video. You just go into Google and Google Memorial Day 2020, and it will come up. You might have to arrow around a little bit, but it will be there. It is an excellent video, if I do say so myself. The committee did a wonderful job and is really worth watching. Another way you can come in is just go through lexmedia.org, and then they will go into YouTube. Trying to give the link this way would be difficult. So anyway, if you want a little entertainment, it's a little long, but I think it's definitely worthwhile to see what Town Celebrations has done. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure where you are in position with your camera, but
I can't see me.
We've seen some interesting parts of you or something, but oh,
Yes.
there you are, your knees.
Wow, my basement.
Okay. Yes, and that video will soon be on our website too for access. It's really a moving, wonderful Memorial Day tribute, and you'll all enjoy it. Okay.
Are there any other questions?
Arthur, are you back? Arthur?
Yeah.
Okay, take it away.
Actually, he needs to be unmuted again.
I thought I did.
I got it. Okay. I thought it ironic. I was in the Army, in the infantry also. And it's ironic that here he was a pilot. He knew the nice thing about being off your feet. And then he went on to a life of podiatry.
Yeah. Well, yes, and he of course, and the family can certainly expand on this, but I know he went to the the Massachusetts College of Podiatry, trained there before he was drafted. So he was well prepared to use his feet all the time. So.
Yeah, I just thought it was kind of funny.
I think that's all right, I don't think we have any more questions, but we have one more question that we would like to ask you, and that is, I mentioned earlier in the program that because we've lost 3 months of programming, we did contact a couple of speakers and say, look, if there was a demand, would you be willing to give a program over the summer? And my goodness, the enthusiasm was terrific. So we do have a couple of super programs that we could offer in July and in August. One would have been our Patriots Day program in April. Lexington Minuteman author, historian, teacher, Alex Kane, talking about Lexington in the 5 years leading up to the Revolutionary War, and how Lexington started out as this little pastoral farming town. And before you know it, it became a hotbed of the revolution. It became one of the motivating towns that led Massachusetts to war. And he'll talk about how that transformation occurred. So it's a very close to home program. The other one is by Bob Began, who has spoken with us several times. And it's a rather tragic story, but a very compelling one. And it is the loss of the USS Indianapolis. And for many people, that's familiar. It's a tragic loss of a ship, and many crew lost, but also stories of heroism where many people survived on the sea in lifeboats and fighting sunstroke and sharks and all kinds of deprivation until they were rescued. And so that's a pretty edge of your seat presentation. So what we're going to do is, on your screen now, do you see this little poll that I've just put up?
I do.
Good. We're going to ask you two questions. One,
Wait a minute.
if the LVA hosted a Zoom program, we don't know, it could be either of those two. On Monday, July 13th, that would have been the second Monday of the month. That would be our regular date. Would you be likely to attend? And in order to vote, I think you just click on polling. Is that right, Jim?
Yes.
Click on polling, and you may click on yes or no. We're just doing question one right now, okay? Or I guess you could do two at the same time. It doesn't matter. So we're going to wait about 30 seconds and ask you, please, to click on polling. And in fact, answer both questions at the same time. Question two is, yes, Jim?
I just wanted to say, I don't think they have to click on polling. I think the poll appeared once you triggered it.
Yes?
Yes, it did.
Is that the case? Okay. So
Yes.
it's real simple.
It's very simple. And answer both questions. If we hosted a Zoom program on Monday, August 10, would you be likely to attend? And we just want to see if it would be worth our while to put one of these together. And of course, now armed with all the experience we've had, we're pretty sure of it. First of all, we know the key to what happened is we interrupted the program, we stopped it, and we're not going to do that again. So, okay. Another 10 seconds.
Yeah, we had to have a little song, a little jingle going here.
Like we used to for the $64,000 question. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Okay. So we've got about 34 people who have participated in the poll, but we do have 51 watching. So I'd like a couple of more people to vote if you would.
I guess we don't have an abstain line.
No.
You
Okay.
have to have a quorum.
Okay.
There was
Well-
one person who's really waving her hands with great gusto.
Oh, really? So I think
Well,
we'll,
I'll unmute her for a moment, okay?
by all means, please. Who is it?
It's someone named Bob.
So I'm ending the poll. Okay. And
Okay. I'm Debbie. I'm Peter's daughter.
oh, hi, Debbie.
I just wanted to thank you, thank Jim, thank Rob, thank everyone that came today for participating and learning more about my dad. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed it, and it really it made me feel really good to think about something else other than what's going on in this world right now, to rethink about my dad and family. And I really appreciate all the time and effort you put into it. Thank you so much, Jim, Rob, and Linda, and everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Well, you know, Debbie, your father was a hero, and you probably never thought of him like that. He was just dad, right? But when
Right,
you
he was-
really see what he accomplished and how brave he was and what he faced every day, you now look at him and say, my goodness, I really am the daughter of a hero. So it's our pleasure to help you see your father in yet another wonderful light. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
I've got one of his little pins here. I just wanted to show you. You can't see it, but very tiny. I've got one of his little
Oh,
glider
wow.
pins.
Yeah.
Super.
So that's very special. But thank you
It is
again.
very special.
Okay. So I'm sharing the results, which I think means everybody can see them at this point, right?
Yep.
Right.
All right. So
I think Arthur Daltus just gave it a thumbs up.
cool.
Hi, Arthur. It looks good.
Well, 92%, I was going to ask Bob to do this, but it's so quick, we'll just go ahead. 92% feel that they would be likely. We're not asking for commitment. It's okay. You don't have to give us your firstborn at this point. 92% would be likely to attend a July meeting, and 83% would be likely to attend an August meeting. So that's very good information. And we're having an executive committee meeting next week. We will ponder that and see if we can accommodate everybody. So that was extremely helpful. Thank you.
Hey, Linda, I have a couple of things to
By all
add.
means, take it away.
One thing is with regard to the presentation, again, apologies, but thanks for bearing with it and me. If you would like, I'll simply give you my email address. If you have any questions that you'd like to direct to me, weren't comfortable with this format or whatever, I'd be happy to take them. It's James Rams, like my name, JAMESRAMS @verizon.net. The other thing I would say is, as most of you know, we record, in fact, Lex Media is recording this presentation. Well, the presentation that they recorded is a mess because of the snafu. So I guess what I will do now is make a commitment to redo this in some appropriate way so that we have a high quality presentation to preserve for the Pecos family and for the association. You know, what we did today really does, I think it probably came across okay, but it really doesn't meet our quality standards, and I want to make that right, so I will.
Yes,
Thank you.
it will be difficult for us to record this again quietly offline. And so anybody who wants to have a souvenir copy or to watch it again in a very short time will be able to watch an unedited, smooth copy.
So, and by the way, for everyone who doesn't know, all of our past programs, including this one eventually, can be found on the LVA website, and they've all been uploaded to YouTube. So that's where you can find the programs. So that's it. Thank you, Linda, for me.
Thank you, Jim. All right, folks, I think that about does it. We want to thank everyone for your patience and for your attendance. Very successful meeting, and it was really fun seeing all our familiar friends again. It was just delightful.